The safehouse door slammed against the wall so hard that the picture frames shook, and Elena Vale stumbled backward into the kitchen table as three masked men flooded the room. One of them seized her arm, while another demanded the location of the file, and the third swept his weapon across the dark hallway, searching for anyone who might have been hiding nearby. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs. Her palms were slick with sweat. She could hear the refrigerator humming behind her, the rain tapping against the windows, and the rough breathing of the men surrounding her. She had been told the farmhouse was secure. She had been told nobody knew where she was. She had been told her husband, Daniel, was 300 miles away and would not be coming back tonight. But there was one thing none of the three men knew. Daniel Vale had never been simply a retired intelligence contractor. 12 years earlier, intelligence agencies had stopped using his real name. In classified circles, he had been known as the Ghost, an operative whose missions were so compartmentalized that even people who worked beside him rarely knew where he came from or where he went afterward. Elena had married Daniel because he made her feel safe, not because she knew what he had once been. He had promised her that the old life was buried, no more operations, no more secret phones, no more disappearing into darkness, and for 13 years he had kept that promise, until tonight. The leader of the three men, a broad-shouldered mercenary named Victor Rourke, leaned toward Elena and demanded the location of the encrypted drive. Elena shook her head. She genuinely did not know where it was. The drive had never been given to her. She had only received a digital file by mistake, a file containing names, payments, shell companies, and evidence connecting powerful people to a private intelligence network that had been operating for years. She had reported it. The authorities had moved her to the safehouse. Then someone had betrayed the location. Rourke grabbed her phone from the counter and glanced at the screen. "Your husband," he said. "Call him." Elena stared at him. "He won't come." Rourke smiled. "That's exactly what I'm counting on." But what Rourke didn't know was that Elena had already triggered the emergency function hidden inside the phone. She had not called the police. She had not called the security team. She had sent 3 words through a dormant encrypted channel that had not been activated in years. Ghost compromised safehouse. 300 miles away, Daniel's phone vibrated once on a hotel table. He looked at the screen. His expression changed instantly. The man sitting across from him, Marcus Reed, noticed it. Marcus had known Daniel for 20 years. He had seen him survive situations that should have killed him. He had watched him remain calm while everyone else panicked. But Marcus had never seen that expression before. "What happened?" he asked. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He read the message again, then he closed his eyes. Elena had been instructed never to use that channel unless she believed her life was in immediate danger. Daniel had personally given her the code years ago and told her she would probably never need it. Now the code was active. His hands were perfectly still. His breathing slowed. The room seemed to become colder. Marcus stood. "Daniel?" Daniel looked at him. "Wake the network." And somewhere inside an abandoned server room thousands of miles away, dormant systems began coming alive, because the Ghost had just received the one message that could bring him out of retirement. Daniel didn't rush toward the safehouse. That was the first thing Marcus noticed. A younger version of Daniel would have been halfway there already, driven by anger and instinct. The man standing in front of him now was different. Older, colder, more deliberate. He opened the old black case he had kept locked inside a storage unit for years. There were no dramatic weapons inside. There was an encrypted communications device, several identity cards, a worn notebook, and a photograph of Daniel from a life Elena had never seen. The photograph showed a younger man standing beside 4 other operatives outside a military facility. No smiles, no insignia, no unit patch. Just 5 men staring into the camera, as if they already knew none of them would remain together forever. Marcus looked at the photograph. "I thought you burned that." Daniel closed the case. "I thought I did too." His phone vibrated again. Hannah Cole, a former surveillance specialist, had joined the network. Her message contained a location and one sentence. Safehouse cameras were disabled internally. Daniel stared at the screen. "Internally?" Marcus asked. Daniel nodded. That changed everything. The attackers hadn't simply found the farmhouse. Someone inside the security structure had opened the door for them. Hannah sent another message. 3 men entered at 2347. no exterior approach detected. Daniel felt something tighten behind his eyes. The safe house had been selected precisely because it was isolated, difficult to approach unnoticed, and protected by independent security systems. If the cameras had been disabled from inside, then someone had either compromised the system remotely or had access to the security credentials. Daniel's first instinct was to call Elena. He stopped himself. If the attackers were monitoring her phone, calling could expose their awareness of the emergency signal. Instead, he asked Hannah to track every available communication pathway and Marcus to begin reconstructing the safe house's digital history. He wanted facts, not assumptions. Meanwhile, inside the farmhouse, Elena was being pushed toward a basement room. She stumbled on the final step and caught herself against the wall. Rourke followed her. "Where is the drive?" he demanded again. "I don't have it." "Then where is your husband?" Elena looked directly at him. "I told you, he isn't coming." Rourke smiled. "You still believe that?" Elena said nothing. She was frightened, but beneath the fear was something else. She knew Daniel. She knew the way he handled emergencies. He wouldn't charge blindly into a trap. He would study it first. That thought gave her a small amount of strength. Rourke noticed her expression and misunderstood it. He thought she was breaking. He didn't realize she was beginning to hope. In the basement, the third mercenary, a younger man named Cole Mercer, checked the exits. "Something feels wrong," he said. Rourke dismissed him. "Nothing feels wrong. We control the house." Cole looked toward the ceiling. "Then why did the cameras come back online for 11 seconds? Rourke froze. 11 seconds. That was enough for someone to see them, enough to identify them, enough to transmit their location. Rourke immediately reached for his radio. Nothing. Static. He tried again. Still nothing. Upstairs, the lights flickered. Elena looked toward the ceiling. Then her phone, lying on the floor near the stairs, vibrated once. The screen illuminated in the darkness. She couldn't read the entire message, but she saw one line. "Daniel has your location." Her eyes filled with tears. Not because she was safe yet, she wasn't, but because the man she loved had heard her call. And outside the farmhouse, 300 miles away, Daniel was already moving. The drive through the rain took longer than Daniel wanted, but he never exceeded the speed necessary to maintain control. The road was almost empty. Headlights reflected across the wet pavement, and every few minutes lightning illuminated the fields on either side. Marcus sat beside him with a laptop connected to a secure communications system. Hannah remained on the line. Victor Shaw, the oldest member of the old network, had begun contacting legitimate federal authorities through channels that could withstand political interference. Daniel refused to turn this into a private war. Elena needed to be rescued, the attackers needed to be arrested, the people who had ordered the operation needed to be exposed. Anything beyond that was noise, but there was something bothering him. The attackers had asked Elena for the encrypted drive, yet Elena had never possessed it. Daniel knew that. The people who organized the operation should have known it too, unless they weren't really after the drive. Unless the drive was only an excuse. Marcus looked over. "I think we found something." Daniel glanced at the screen. "What?" The file Elena received was sent from a compromised account inside the investigation. Daniel's jaw tightened. "Whose?" Marcus shook his head. "That's the problem. The account was scrubbed." Hannah interrupted. "Not completely." A series of records appeared. Someone used the account 36 hours before Elena received the file. Daniel asked, "Who?" Hannah hesitated. "A security administrator assigned to the Safehouse program." Daniel knew the name. Jonathan Pierce. A respected official. 15 years of service. No disciplinary record. No suspicious financial activity. No obvious connection to criminal organizations. The perfect insider. Daniel told Marcus to pull everything on Pierce. Then Elena's signal moved. Marcus looked up. "She's being transported." Daniel's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Where?" "I have the vehicle." A map appeared. The signal was moving away from the farmhouse toward an abandoned industrial district. Daniel recognized the area immediately. Blackridge Warehouse District. Hannah confirmed it. 3 vehicles converging. Daniel slowed the vehicle. "How many people?" "At least 5. Daniel looked toward Marcus. Then the farmhouse was a pickup point. They had never intended to stay there. The attackers had used the safe house as a temporary extraction location. Someone wanted Elena moved before the authorities could arrive. Daniel called Victor. "Can you get local law enforcement there?" "Yes. Do it without alerting Pierce." Victor paused. You think he's involved? I think we don't know who we can trust. Daniel ended the call. He hated uncertainty, but he understood it. The ghost had survived, because he never assumed the first answer was the correct one. At 0041, Elena's vehicle entered the warehouse district. Daniel parked 2 blocks away. He and Marcus moved on foot toward a high overlook where they could observe the facility without exposing themselves. No direct assault, no reckless confrontation. Evidence first, Elena's safety first. Hannah identified 2 external cameras and several vehicles. Then she found something unexpected. Daniel. What? There's another team inside. He looked at the screen. How many? Unknown. Are they ours? No. Daniel stared at the warehouse. For the first time that night, he understood the real shape of the trap. The 3 mercenaries had not come to the Safehouse alone. They had been sent to trigger a response. Someone wanted to force Daniel out of hiding, track him, identify his network, and eliminate everyone connected to him. Elena had been used as bait. The warehouse was the second stage, and the people waiting inside were expecting the ghost. Daniel whispered, "They know I'm here." Marcus looked at him. "Then why haven't they moved?" Daniel watched the warehouse windows. "Because they want me to walk inside." And that was when Hannah discovered the final piece of the trap. The warehouse lights came on simultaneously. Every window glowed white against the rain-soaked darkness. Daniel stood motionless behind the concrete barrier, studying the building. It reminded him of another night, years earlier, in a city he had promised himself never to remember. Same silence. Same deliberate illumination. Same psychological message. Someone inside wanted him to know they were ready. Marcus whispered, "We can wait for federal teams." Daniel nodded. "We will." He wasn't going inside, not yet. Elena's signal remained active, which meant the attackers had not taken her phone completely or had failed to detect the emergency transmitter. That gave Daniel something invaluable: time. Inside the warehouse, Rourke stood across from Elena. Her wrists were bound, but she was conscious. Cole paced nearby. The 3rd mercenary, Mason Gray, watched the entrance. "He's outside," Mason said. Rourke smiled. "I know." Elena looked at them. "You don't know him." Rourke laughed. "Everybody has a weakness," Elena answered quietly. "You just found his." Rourke leaned closer. "Exactly." Elena shook her head. "No, you found mine." Rourke's smile disappeared. "What does that mean?" Elena looked toward the warehouse doors. "It means you don't understand what Daniel will do." She didn't know what Daniel would do either. She only knew what he had spent 13 years refusing to become again. Rourke didn't understand the difference between capability and intention. He believed a dangerous man was dangerous because he was willing to use violence. Daniel had learned the opposite lesson. The most dangerous person in a crisis was the one who had the ability to act but the discipline to wait. Outside, federal authorities began arriving in unmarked vehicles. Victor coordinated the perimeter. Hannah continued collecting digital evidence. Marcus reconstructed the communications chain. Daniel watched the warehouse. "There," he said. A man appeared briefly behind a second-floor window. Marcus zoomed in. Jonathan Pierce. Daniel felt no surprise. Pierce had betrayed the Safehouse system. He had arranged Elena's relocation. He had provided the attackers with credentials. "But why?" Hannah answered before Daniel could ask. "Money." She sent financial records. Payments had been routed through shell companies connected to an international private intelligence broker named Adrian Voss. Voss had been investigated 3 times and escaped prosecution each time. His business model was simple: collect sensitive information, sell it to the highest bidder, then erase the evidence. Elena's file had threatened him. Daniel's existence threatened him more. The warehouse was meant to eliminate both problems. Daniel looked at the building again. "We go in when the federal team is ready." Marcus asked, "And if they hurt Elena?" Daniel's expression hardened. "Then we move faster." At 0103, the federal commander gave the signal. The operation began. Doors opened. Teams moved into position. The warehouse suddenly erupted in confusion as authorities entered from multiple sides. Daniel stayed outside for several seconds longer, watching patterns, listening to communications, waiting for the moment when he could move without making Elena more vulnerable. Then a single transmission came through his earpiece. Elena's location confirmed. Daniel moved. He entered through a secured side access with the federal team, not alone, not as a vigilante, but as a man determined to bring his wife home. And somewhere on the second floor, Rourke realized the trap had reversed. The warehouse became a maze of corridors, storage rooms, metal staircases, and abandoned offices. Daniel moved with the federal team, following instructions and keeping his attention on the information coming through his earpiece. He wasn't there to hunt people, he was there to find Elena. The first rooms were empty, then they found evidence, computers, documents, financial records, surveillance equipment, photographs of Elena, photographs of Daniel, maps of the Safehouse. Every piece of evidence confirmed the conspiracy. Marcus's voice came through the communications channel. "Daniel, we've got the network server." Daniel answered, "Copy." Hannah said, "There's a secondary room on the east side." Daniel changed direction. 2 federal agents followed. They found Jonathan Pierce hiding behind a locked office door. Pierce looked terrified. He raised his hands immediately. "I didn't hurt her." Daniel stared at him. "Where is my wife?" Pierce swallowed. "Basement level." Daniel stepped closer. "How many men?" "3. Who hired them?" Pierce hesitated. "Voss." Daniel felt a surge of anger, but kept his voice controlled. "Why?" Pierce looked down. "Because Voss knew Elena had the file. He thought killing her would destroy the evidence." Daniel shook his head. "And me?" Pierce's eyes lifted. "Voss wanted you alive." Daniel froze. "Why?" Pierce whispered. He wanted to know whether the ghost was still alive. The answer landed like ice. This entire operation had been designed as an experiment. Voss had been testing rumors. He had heard stories about Daniel's past and wanted proof. Elena had become the trigger. Pierce had betrayed the Safehouse. Rourke had executed the operation. Voss had watched from a distance. Daniel suddenly understood why the warehouse had been illuminated, why the cameras had been manipulated, why the attackers had remained visible. They wanted a reaction. They wanted Daniel to reveal himself. But they had underestimated something. Daniel wasn't alone anymore. He had Marcus, Hannah, Victor, federal investigators, and Elena's courage. He moved toward the basement. Rourke heard the team approaching and grabbed Elena, pulling her away from the door. "Stop!" he shouted. The corridor went silent. Daniel saw Elena through the doorway. Her face was bruised and exhausted, but her eyes were clear. Rourke held her behind him. "You want her?" he called. Daniel answered, "Yes." "Then come alone." Daniel looked at Elena. She gave the smallest shake of her head. "Don't." He understood immediately. Rourke wanted a private confrontation. Daniel refused. He told the federal team exactly where Rourke was and waited for the tactical commander to establish communication. The goal was to resolve the standoff without unnecessary harm. Rourke demanded a vehicle, then money. Then safe passage, one demand after another. Each request was recorded. Each threat became evidence. Eventually, Rourke's confidence began to collapse. He had expected a ghost. Instead, he found accountability. He expected fear. Instead, he found a system closing around him. Elena kept looking at Daniel. He kept looking back. No words were necessary. Then Rourke made his final mistake. He stepped away from Elena. The federal team moved immediately. Elena was pulled safely from the room. Rourke surrendered moments later. Daniel reached Elena and held her tightly. She buried her face against his shoulder. He whispered, "I'm here," she answered. "I knew you would be." And for the first time that night, Daniel felt the weight in his chest begin to release. The aftermath lasted longer than the operation itself. Investigators spent days cataloging evidence from the warehouse. The servers contained years of financial records, surveillance files, and communications between Voss's organization and corrupt officials. Jonathan Pierce cooperated immediately. Rourke and the other mercenaries were charged with multiple serious offenses. The investigation expanded across several jurisdictions. Elena's file became the center of a much larger case, but Daniel didn't celebrate. He didn't feel victorious. He spent most of the first week beside Elena, helping her recover from the trauma. She slept poorly. Sudden noises made her tense. She sometimes woke before dawn and reached across the bed to make sure he was still there. Daniel understood. He had lived with those instincts for years. The difference was that he had chosen them. Elena had not. One morning, she found him sitting alone on the porch. "You're thinking about leaving," she said. Daniel looked at her. "No. You're thinking about the old life." He didn't answer. She sat beside him. "Daniel, I know you lied to me." He looked down. I know. I know you weren't just some contractor. He nodded. I know there were things you couldn't tell me. Another nod. Elena took his hand. But I also know what you did that night. Daniel looked at her. What? You didn't become the ghost. Her words surprised him. You could have. Yes. But you didn't. She squeezed his hand. You came for me as my husband. Daniel looked toward the horizon. That distinction mattered more than he could explain. For years he had feared that the ghost was the real version of him, and Daniel Vale was only a disguise. But that night had shown him the truth. The ghost had been a tool. Daniel was the man he had chosen to become. Meanwhile, investigators traced the money to Adrian Voss. His organization had operated through layers of shell corporations and private security companies. Voss had escaped prosecution in the past because witnesses disappeared, records vanished, and investigations were compromised. This time was different. The evidence was overwhelming. The digital trail was preserved in multiple jurisdictions. Financial records had been copied before anyone could destroy them. Communications had been authenticated. The case moved forward. Months later, Voss was arrested while attempting to leave the country. He claimed the entire operation had been fabricated. Then prosecutors played the recordings. His own voice, his own instructions, his own payments. The room became silent. The man who had believed himself untouchable finally understood that his greatest weakness had never been money. It had been arrogance. He believed everyone could be bought. He believed everyone had a price. He believed fear always worked. But Elena had refused to give him the file. Daniel had refused to give him the reaction he wanted. Marcus and Hannah had preserved the evidence. Victor had brought legitimate authorities into the operation. And the system he thought he controlled had finally turned against him. When Elena heard that Voss had been arrested, she didn't celebrate. She simply closed her eyes and exhaled. It's over, she said. Daniel looked at her. Yes. But both of them knew healing would take longer than justice. 1 year later, Daniel and Elena returned to the farmhouse where the nightmare had started. The property had been restored. The damaged doors were replaced. The broken windows were new. The basement had been cleaned and repainted. There was nothing left that looked like the night 3 mercenaries had entered. Elena walked slowly through the kitchen. She touched the counter where she had once stood surrounded by strangers. Then she looked toward Daniel. Funny, she said. It feels smaller now, Daniel smiled. Trauma makes places bigger. She nodded. They walked outside. The evening sun was low over the fields, and the same road stretched toward the horizon. Daniel remembered standing there months earlier, convinced that his past had returned to take everything from him. Now he understood that his past had not returned. It had simply reminded him why he had left it. Elena stood beside him. Do you ever regret marrying me? Daniel laughed softly. You mean because of all the secrets? Yes. No, she looked at him. Not even a little? Not even once, she smiled. Then she asked the question that had been waiting between them since the night at the warehouse. If you had to do it again, would you? Daniel knew exactly what she meant. Would he return to the old life? Would he risk everything? Would he become the ghost again? He looked at her and answered carefully. I'd do whatever I had to do to get you home. Elena accepted the answer. She didn't need to know more. They sat together on the porch as darkness settled over the property. For the first time, Daniel didn't scan the tree line. He didn't check the windows. He didn't count vehicles on the road. He didn't listen for footsteps. He simply sat beside his wife. That was his victory. Not the arrest of Rourke, not the exposure of Voss, not the destruction of the network. His victory was being able to sit in the same place where he had once expected violence and feel peace instead. The ghost had spent years believing survival meant staying one step ahead of danger. Daniel finally understood that survival meant knowing when to stop running. Elena rested her head against his shoulder. You're quiet. I'm thinking. About what? Daniel looked toward the stars. About how close we came to losing everything. Elena took his hand. But we didn't. No, he smiled. We didn't. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had survived. Every secret. Every fear. Every unanswered question. And eventually, Elena said something that made Daniel laugh. You know what I hate? What? That your ridiculous old nickname is actually kind of impressive. Daniel laughed again. Please never say that to anyone. She smiled. Why? Because I spent years trying to make sure nobody remembered it. Too late. She squeezed his hand. I remember. And Daniel realized he didn't mind anymore. The name Ghost no longer represented the man he had been, it represented the chapter he had survived. The life he had chosen afterward was something different, something warmer, something real. He looked at Elena. Let's go home. She stood. This is home. Daniel looked at the farmhouse. Then at her. Then let's stay. And they did. The final report concluded that the Safehouse attack had been one part of a much larger conspiracy, but investigators never fully understood one thing: why Daniel had remained so calm during the operation. The answer was simple. He had learned long ago that anger was expensive. It made people reckless. It made them predictable. It made them easy to manipulate. Rourke expected rage. Voss expected panic. Pierce expected fear. None of them expected patience. None expected Daniel to protect Elena without turning the situation into a bloodbath. That decision saved lives and preserved the evidence necessary to dismantle the network. Months after the arrests, Marcus visited Daniel and Elena. They sat around the kitchen table, drinking coffee. Marcus looked at Daniel and said, "You know, I never thought you'd come back." Daniel smiled. "Neither did I." Hannah joined them later by video call. Victor sent a message from overseas. For the first time in years, the old network wasn't being used for an operation. They were simply talking. No codes, no missions, no targets, just people who had survived a dangerous chapter of their lives. Elena watched them and finally understood the scale of Daniel's past. She didn't ask for classified details. She didn't need them. She saw the loyalty between them. She saw the scars. She saw the weight they carried. And she understood why Daniel had spent so many years trying to leave it behind. Later that evening, after everyone had gone, Elena asked him one final question. "Do you think they won because they found you?" Daniel considered it. "No. Why not?" "Because they thought finding the ghost would destroy Daniel." Elena smiled. "But it didn't." Daniel shook his head. "It reminded me who Daniel really is." He looked at her. "You did that." She rolled her eyes. "Don't make this too sentimental." He laughed. They walked upstairs together. Outside, the night was quiet. No vehicles stopped on the road. No phones vibrated with emergency messages. No unknown numbers called. For the first time in 13 years, Daniel slept without keeping a secure phone beside the bed. He woke before sunrise anyway. Old habits. But instead of reaching for a weapon or checking a perimeter, he reached for Elena's hand. She was still asleep. He smiled. Then he closed his eyes again. That small moment meant more than any victory. Because the ghost had survived, but Daniel had finally learned that survival wasn't the same as living. Living was sitting beside the person you loved and knowing you didn't have to disappear tomorrow. Living was hearing silence and not expecting danger. Living was walking through a doorway without checking the corners. Living was letting the past remain where it belonged. Behind you, the three mercenaries had wanted a file. Voss had wanted a reaction. Pierce had wanted money. They had all believed Elena was the weakest part of the operation. They were wrong. Elena was the reason Daniel refused to become what they expected. She was the reason the truth survived. She was the reason the ghost finally stayed buried, and that was the part none of them could have predicted. They thought they were hunting a legend. Instead, they awakened a husband who had finally discovered that the strongest weapon he possessed was not violence. It was restraint. It was loyalty. It was the ability to walk away from darkness after proving he could survive it. And when Elena woke that morning, she found Daniel sitting beside the window with a cup of coffee. She looked at him and smiled. "Good morning." Daniel smiled back. "Good morning." Nothing dramatic happened. No alarm sounded. No enemy appeared. No secret message arrived. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Because after everything they had survived, an ordinary morning was no longer ordinary. It was a victory. Years later, people would tell stories about the ghost. They would whisper about missions that had never appeared in newspapers, operations that existed only in fragments of classified records, and an operative who seemed to disappear whenever the mission ended. Some would exaggerate, some would invent details, some would claim he had never existed. Daniel never corrected them. He didn't care. The truth belonged to a different life. His real life was the woman sitting across from him at breakfast, the photographs on their walls, the garden Elena insisted on maintaining, even when Daniel said she was terrible at gardening, and the quiet evenings when they watched old movies and argued about which character would survive. The past had become something they could talk about without allowing it to control them. One evening, Elena found the old photograph in a drawer. She held it carefully. The younger Daniel stared back at her from another lifetime. "You look angry," she said. Daniel looked over her shoulder. "I was." "Why?" "Because I thought being angry made me stronger." Elena studied the photograph. "Were you wrong?" Daniel smiled. "Completely." She returned the photograph to the drawer. "Good." Daniel asked. "Why?" "Because I like this version better." He pulled her close. "Me too." The photograph stayed in the drawer. The old identification card stayed beside it. The black encrypted phone was never activated again. The ghost was finished. Not because he had lost his ability, not because he had become weaker, but because he had finally learned that power was not measured by how much destruction a person could cause. It was measured by how much destruction they could prevent. Elena had once been trapped inside a farmhouse with 3 mercenaries who believed she was helpless. She had been afraid, exhausted, and uncertain whether she would survive. But she had triggered a message. She had bought time. She had refused to give them what they wanted, and somewhere far away, her husband had received those 3 words and remembered exactly who he was. Not a weapon, not a legend, not a ghost, a husband, a man who had made a promise. That promise had carried him through the night. It had carried Elena through the fear, and it had brought them both home. Sometimes people think justice requires becoming colder than the people who hurt you. It doesn't. Sometimes justice requires becoming smarter, calmer, more patient, more disciplined. The 3 mercenaries wanted Daniel to lose control. He refused. Voss wanted him exposed. He survived without surrendering his principles. Pierce wanted money. He lost everything. Elena wanted only to make it home. She did. And Daniel wanted one thing above all else: a life where he didn't have to be the ghost anymore. He got it. On their anniversary, Elena raised a glass and said, "To surviving the worst night of our lives." Daniel shook his head. "To building something better afterward." She smiled. "That sounds more like you." He raised his glass. "Then that's what we drink to." Their glasses touched softly. Outside, the world continued moving. Cars passed. People laughed. Lights came on in distant houses. Nobody knew what had happened there years earlier. Nobody needed to. The story belonged to them. The ghost had disappeared again. But this time, nobody was hunting him. He had simply gone home. And he stayed there. If you stayed with Daniel and Elena all the way to the end, then you know this was never really a story about 3 mercenaries, a safe house, or a mysterious operative. It was about what happens when someone is forced to confront the darkest version of themselves and chooses not to become it. Elena survived because she refused to surrender. Daniel succeeded because he refused to lose control. And the people behind the attack fell because they believed fear was more powerful than truth. It wasn't. Truth survived, Elena survived, their marriage survived. And the ghost finally became a memory instead of a weapon. So let me ask you something. Where are you watching from? Comment your city or country below. What kind of story do you want next? Military revenge, psychological thriller, or emotional family justice? And here's the moral question I want you to debate. If you were in Daniel's shoes, with the person you love trapped inside that warehouse, would you have waited for the authorities and trusted the evidence to bring justice, or would fear and anger have pushed you to take matters into your own hands? There is no easy answer. That's what makes the question worth asking, because sometimes the hardest battle isn't defeating the person standing against you. Sometimes it's controlling yourself when everything inside you is demanding revenge. Daniel could have become the ghost again. Instead, he chose to be Elena's husband, and perhaps that was the greatest victory of all. Thank you for listening. Stay safe, stay strong, and remember, sometimes the quietest choice is the one that takes the most courage. Until the next story.
पापा बोला तो
लाइट तो चल रही है। आपने लाइटो देखनी है?
हाँ
चलें फिर बी पे।
नहीं
लाइटो नहीं देखनी? पता नहीं कहाँ है।